Chapter 2. Mrs. Who. When Meg woke to the jangling of her alarm clock, the wind was still blowing, but the sun was shining. The worst of the storm was over. She sat up in bed, shaking her head to clear it. It must have been a dream. She'd been frightened by the storm and worried about the tramp, so she'd just dreamed about going down to the kitchen and seeing Mrs. Watson and having her mother get all frightened and upset by that word. What was it? Tess something. She dressed hurriedly, picked up the kitten still curled up on the bed, and dumped it unceremoniously on the floor. The kitten yawned, stretched, gave a piteous meow, trotted out of the attic and down the stairs. Meg made her bed and hurried after it. In the kitchen, her mother was making French toast, and the twins were already at the table. The kitten was lapping milk out of a saucer. "Where's Charles?" Meg asked. "Still asleep. We had rather an interrupted night, if you remember." "I hoped it was a dream," Meg said. Her mother carefully turned over 4 slices of French toast, and then said in a steady voice, "No, Meg, don't hope it was a dream. I don't understand it any more than you do, but one thing I've learned is that you don't have to understand things for them to be. I'm sorry I showed you I was upset. Your father and I used to have a joke about tesseract." "What is a tesseract?" Meg asked. "It's a concept." Mrs. Murray handed the twins the syrup. "I'll try to explain it to you later. There isn't time before school." "I don't see why you didn't wake us up," Denny said. "To Jip! We missed out on all the fun." "You'll be a lot more awake in school today than I will." Meg took her French toast to the table. "Who cares?" Sandy said. "If you're going to let old tramps come into the house in the middle of the night, Mother, you ought to have Den and me around to protect you." "After all, Father would expect us to," Denny's added. "We know you have a great mind and all, Mother," Sandy said, "but you don't have much sense, and certainly Meg and Charles don't." "I know. We're morons." Meg was bitter. "I wish you wouldn't be such a dope, Meg. Syrup, please." Sandy reached across the table. "You don't have to take everything so personally. Use a happy medium, for heaven's sake. You just goof around in school and look out the window and don't pay any attention." "You just make things harder for yourself," Denny said. "And Charles Wallace is going to have an awful time next year when he starts school. We know he's bright, but he's so funny when he's around other people, and they're so used to thinking he's dumb. I don't know what's going to happen to him. Sandy and I'll sock anybody who picks on him, but that's about all we can do. Let's not worry about next year till we get through this one," Mrs. Murray said. "More French toast, boys." At school, Meg was tired, and her eyelids sagged, and her mind wandered. In social studies, she was asked to name the principal imports and exports of Nicaragua, and though she had looked them up dutifully the evening before, now she could remember none of them. The teacher was sarcastic, and the rest of the class laughed, and she flung herself down in her seat in a fury. "Who cares about the imports and exports of Nicaragua anyhow?" she muttered. "If you're going to be rude, Margaret, you may leave the room," the teacher said. "Okay, I will." Meg flounced out. During study hall, the principal sent for her. "What seems to be the problem, Meg?" he asked pleasantly enough. Meg looked sulkily down at the floor. "Nothing, Mr. Jenkins." "Mrs. Porter tells me you were inexcusably rude." Meg shrugged. "Don't you realize that you just make things harder for yourself by your attitude?" the principal asked. "Now, Meg, I'm convinced that you can do the work and keep up with your grade if you will apply yourself, but some of your teachers are not. You're going to have to do something about yourself. Nobody can do it for you." Meg was silent. "Well, what about it, Meg?" "I don't know what to do." Meg said. "You could do your homework for one thing. Wouldn't your mother help you?" If I asked her to." "Meg, is something troubling you? Are you unhappy at home?" Mr. Jenkins asked. At last Meg looked at him, pushing her glasses in a characteristic gesture. "Everything's fine at home." "I'm glad to hear it. But I know it must be hard on you to have your father away." Meg eyed the principal warily and ran her tongue over the barbed line of her braces. "Have you had any news from him lately?" Meg was sure it was not only imagination that made her feel that behind Mr. Jenkins' surface concern was a gleam of avid curiosity. Wouldn't he like to know, she thought. And if I knew anything, he's the last person I'd tell. Well, one of the last. The postmistress must know that it was almost a year now since the last letter, and heaven knows how many people she'd told, or what unkind guesses she'd made about the reason for the long silence. Mr. Jenkins waited for an answer, but Meg only shrugged. "Just what was your father's line of business?" Mr. Jenkins asked. "Some kind of scientist, wasn't he?" "He's a physicist." Meg bared her teeth to reveal the two ferocious lines of braces. "Meg, don't you think you'd make a better adjustment to life if you faced facts?" "I do face facts," Meg said. "They're lots easier to face than people, I can tell you." "Then why don't you face facts about your father?" "You leave my father out of it," Meg shouted. "Stop bellowing," Mr. Jenkins said sharply. "Do you want the entire school to hear you?" "So what?" Meg demanded. "I'm not ashamed of anything I'm saying. Are you?" Mr. Jenkins sighed. "Do you enjoy being the most belligerent, uncooperative child in school?" Meg ignored this. She leaned over the desk toward the principal. "Mr. Jenkins, you've met my mother, haven't you? You can't accuse her of not facing facts, can you? She's a scientist. She has doctor's degrees in both biology and bacteriology. Her business is facts. When she tells me that my father isn't coming home, I'll believe it. As long as she says father is coming home, then I'll believe that." Mr. Jenkins sighed again. "No doubt your mother wants to believe that your father is coming home, Meg. Very well. I can't do anything else with you. Go back to study hall. Try to be a little less antagonistic. Maybe your work would improve if your general attitude were more tractable."